So it seems there's been a major rules leak for the codexes this week, and Adeptus Custodes have escaped confinement early. Let's talk through the full rules for the Auric Champions and the Null Maiden's detachment, though admittedly the internet reaction to these hasn't been great at first impression. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're covering some leaks, and in this video I thought we'd talk a bit about where they seem to have come from, and then go on to go through the leaks in detail, with a bit of discussion as to what's looking strong or what's looking bad for the Custodes. As we've been talking about over the past few days or so, it's a really big week for Warhammer 40k, 2 new codexes dropping. They're all going up for pre-order on the 13th of April, so full release is likely going to be on the 27th. At this point, it almost seems to be a tradition for Games Workshop to find some way to leak the rules early a week before. Despite reportedly doing things to rein in their playtester program from 9th edition, it still seems to be happening with quite a lot of regularity. I wasn't expecting these ones to leak quite so much, given that they're not coming in big Battle Force box sets, but it still seems that life finds a way. The leak this time is for 3 rather important pages for the Adeptus Custodes Codex, currently being hotly debated all over Reddit and Discord currently. These ones aren't exactly hard to find with a simple Google search. In the leak, we've basically got 3 out of the 4 detachments fully leaked: the Shield Host, the Null Maiden Vigil, and the Auric Champions. Perhaps the Null Maiden Vigil and the Auric Champions were the ones that I was most keen to see, as we haven't really seen any sort of rules previews of them yet, and the Auric Champions wasn't really particularly obvious what that was even going to be themed about. Now the rules are out, it looks like it's a detachment that's entirely focused around Custodes characters, trying to make Custodes work extra well for Hero Hammer, I guess. I'll admit the online discussion to these detachments has been rather negative. Auric Champions focusing on basically characters only really does limit its scope. Even the Custodes do have some big hitting and powerful ones. Just not really having any major support for the actual Custodes datasheets doesn't help. For the Null Maiden Task Force, there's a few interesting rules, though it just doesn't really look like it's going to be enough to make them actually threatening as a full army. I feel like they've done far worse than the Kroot detachment did for the Tau for that. They weirdly seem to be playing Battleshock games sort of like Chaos Knights, but not really as effective, and they're not quite as durable or dangerous as those. The Shield Host is looking like the best out of the 3 detachments at my first impressions, though obviously we haven't seen the full rules for the talents of the Emperor yet. Though even for this one, while there are still a few very interesting rules, a lot of the best stuff is just basically outright gone. Some of the most powerful stratagems like -1 damage, resurrecting Custodes, and the fights first, they've all bitten the dust. I still say that before you get overly emotional about it, I'd wait for the points cost to come out. We don't have the full detachment rules for the Talons of the Emperor detachment either, which feels like it might be the most central one out of the Codex, seeing as it supports all of them. And we also don't know any datasheet changes as well, though even they're kind of moot depending on how they points cost the rest of the army. If it really is looking weak out of the gate, then Games Workshop will no doubt adjust things in a future balance pass, though it might take a few months down the line. I feel like just on pure Custodes stat lines, they absolutely have the strength to be a powerful army in Warhammer 40k. They just need appropriate points costs for the rules. I do kind of hope whichever did the initial Codex points for the Dark Angels, though, weren't involved with the Custodes Codex launch. As ever, the book will be going live at the weekend. If you are looking to pre-order a copy of it, then feel free to check out the links down in the video description. They can save you a bit of money versus Games Workshop, anywhere between 10 and 20% worldwide. Anything bought through them does help to support Auspex Tactics as well, and keep all these videos coming. Let's jump in though and start out with the Auric Champions. This one now looks like it's a Hero Hammer Custodes detachment, everything geared around supporting characters. They'll get the Martial Qatar special rule, as will the rest of the Custodes, and their core rule is called Assemblage of Might. This one is a focal damage boost against one unit in the enemy army. You pick the enemy unit in your command phase, and then character models within your army get +1 to wound the target that you've nominated. So say you could have shield captains going around with +1 to wound on their guardian spears, or blade champions with that scary strength 6 and damage 3 profile at +1 to wound against that unit. It is very much worded as character models, not character units, though unfortunately. It means that you can't get that big boost on anything that's led by a character, it is just literally the character themselves. Unfortunately, I just don't think that's really great. I'm not sure it'd weigh up very well against the 4+ save against mortal and devastating wounds that they get at the moment. Realistically, per turn in the game, this will probably add up to being +1 to wound for maybe 1 or 2 models in your army a turn, and sometimes not even that if your characters can't make combat. That being said, it's not nothing. It means that each time, say something like a blade champion hits home, you'll really feel it. but it really feels like quite a minimal rule for a thing that's supposed to buff a whole army. I don't know if this is just what Games Workshop's going for overall. Custodes seem to be an army that have powerful stat lines and a fairly powerful and easy to use melee damage buff on their core rules, but their detachment rules do seem kind of weak on the core rules at least. Getting into their stratagems, and all of these are epic deeds. For 1 command point, there's Slayer of Champions. This one happens when a character unit destroys your assemblage of might target for the turn. You get to immediately nominate a new assemblage of might target, so you could get the +1 to wound boost with a different character somewhere else on the board, and if the destroyed unit was a character unit, then you gain 1 CP, basically making this stratagem free. Ideally, I guess what you want to do is have a big scary Custodes melee unit, charge it against one of the enemy's units led by a character, destroy that unit with the +1 to wound, and then throw the boost somewhere else for another Custodes character making melee. It's definitely not going to happen every turn, but every so often that will be handy enough, I guess. Essentially a free +1 to wound if you kill the right thing. For 2 CP, there's Superhuman Reserves. You use this ability after using a once per battle army ability, and then you can use it once per battle once more, though not within the same phase. You can only use this stratagem once as well. Could be nice for the 2 rounds of +6 attacks for Trajan Valoris potentially. I feel like that might be the only case where it could be worthwhile, seeing as you can kill an awful lot of things with 6 attacks from that Watcher's Axe. It doesn't really seem anywhere near good enough to use on other targets though. 2 CP is a lot. You are kind of gambling on Trajan Valoris not being wiped out by the enemy's counterattack after he has killed something meaningful as well, so there is at least a chance that you could spend 2 CP and then get no reward for it whatsoever if the opponent unexpectedly destroys your unit. For 1 command point, there's the Emperor's Auspice. This one is a reactive 4+ feel no pain type save for a character model when the unit is attacked. Again, this one only applies to the character, so I guess it could be a tool for trying to keep the character alive and kicking and ready to either strike back or survive till the next turn. In general, I'd say that's not awful. Could make a 6 wound character twice as hard to kill, basically around about as tough as an entire squad of Custodes put together. It's not as good on Trajan Valoris as he already gets the feel no pain. It is perhaps a bit annoying though that this only triggers once you've wiped out your entire bodyguard unit though, and your character is down to running solo. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Earning of a Name. A character model gets to reroll hits and wounds against monsters and vehicles this fight phase, which honestly I think is really quite a nice boost. This one's fairly terrifying on just about every character. Seems really good for Trajan Valoris or a Blade Champion. In general though, anything that's wounding on a 5+ will really like this. I'd say this could well be one of the strongest stratagems, particularly as you already get a +1 to wound. You could be wounding a monster or vehicle 3 out of every 4 times, even with something you are wounding on a 5+ normally. For 2 command points, there's Vigil Unending. This is a character model fighting in death, and you only have to commit to it after they've actually died. 2 CP is a really big investment, though situationally it could certainly be worth it with the amount of attacks the Custodes characters can bring. If you could take down half a squad's worth of elite infantry on the death throes of a Blade Champion or Mr. Valoris, it could be worth the spend. Finally, for 1 CP, we've got Shoulder the Mantle. You use this at the end of your movement phase, and a character gets to attach to another squad. I guess this one's designed for a character being next to another unit after they've had their bodyguard destroyed, and then they can lead them into the fray anew. I kind of like the idea for this, though I sort of feel like it maybe could have been part of the passive detachment core abilities. Seems annoying to have to spend resources to be able to do it. I'm really not sure if it's going to actually be relevant in this detachment though, given that literally everything supports characters here. I just can't imagine you'd really want to take a bodyguard unit of custodians without a leader. You're going to want to put in as many characters as you possibly can in this detachment to make it as worth it as possible. Out of these ones, for pure value, I feel like that Earning a Name one for better damage against monsters and vehicles seems like one of the strongest options. Slayer of Champions will be nice whenever it could get you the free extra +1 to wound if you wipe out a character. I feel like most of the rest of them seem kind of situational to bad though, unfortunately. Certainly none of the rest feel like any sort of staple stratagem. Moving on to enhancements though, which are perhaps particularly relevant in a detachment that focuses on characters. It seems that for the Auric Champions enhancements, Games Workshop has pretty much copy-pasted the enhancements and moved them over to here. For the most part, they are quite similar. I feel like Veiled Blade was one of the better ones before. First up we have Blade Imperator. This one's mortal wound impact hits, a 4+ chance for D3 mortal wounds on the charge, and then once per game, one enemy unit must take a battle shock test that you charge into as well. Not a fan of this one really, the damage output isn't reliable enough or strong enough to be particularly meaningful, and battle shock in your own fight phase is a bit whatever. Inspirational Exemplar is a leadership boost. It gives you leadership 5+, and a once per game cancel battle shock that happens to one unit within 12 inches, and you have to trigger that at the start of any phase. Both of those things aren't terrible to have if it is costed cheap enough. I certainly wouldn't want to pay lots for this though. One weakness is that it doesn't really guard against a failed battle shock test in your own command phase, as basically you've got your battle shock test, then you'll immediately score objectives, and that test will still stand, and the first time you could cancel that failed battle shock would be at the start of the movement phase, by which time it's too late. Could be okay though if maybe the enemy debuffed you with a battle shock test in their turn, and you had a unit that was contesting or controlling an objective to stop them scoring. In that situation, it might be able to be used to deny the enemy victory points, or if you wanted to use one of the stratagems. Next up, we've got Veiled Blade, which is +2 attacks in melee. If cheap enough, that's really quite great. In a detachment that's all about fighty characters, making them even more lethal is pretty scary. That seems great on the Blade Champion. And once per game as well, you get the option to triple the bearer's objective control at the start of any command phase, and it lasts until the end of the turn. Again, that's another very nice one to have. The standard Custodes characters are OC2, so you gain +4 OC there. There's at least a reasonable chance that that could be enough to swing an objective from the enemy control to yours. I feel like that's an enhancement with two useful parts, provided it is cheap enough. Finally, we've got Martial Philosopher. The bearer's unit can shoot and charge after falling back, and once per game you get a reactive normal move of 6 inches if the enemy moves within 9. Alongside Veil Blade, I would say that this one's one of the better ones out of the detachment. That reactive move, even if it's once per game, is pretty enormous on a massive scary unit of the Custodes. It means you could have an enemy unit walk up to you, and then you suddenly hide behind a ruin out of line of sight, so they just can't damage your scary Custodes this turn. Or if an enemy unit was moving up to try and charge you, you get to backpedal 6 inches, hopefully they'll fall short, and then you get to charge them yourself in your own turn. The fallback shoot and charge thing is definitely not useless either. Custodes are tanky enough that they might easily survive a round in close combat, being able to fall back, shoot something with Guardian Spear attacks, and then plunge into either the same target or something else with fights first. That's going to be great to have in the midfield. Overall, between all that, I'd certainly rate Veiled Blade and Martial Philosopher as the most interesting ones out of these. At the right points cost, these could be fine. Overall, I do like the idea of trying to make a Custodes force that works around characters and has them at the absolute heart of the army. I think it is quite a fun image. With these rules though, I'm not sure if they've quite done enough. The core rule is a bit underwhelming in my opinion. It's going to only affect one close combat per turn. Though don't get me wrong, Blade Champions and Shield Captains in this detachment will be scary. The rerolls versus monsters and vehicles feels like it could take characters to the next level and certainly have them absolutely terrifying to the enemy heavies, particularly Trajan Valoris when he activates the Moment Shackle. Potentially having 12 attacks with 4 rerolls and +1 to wound is going to leave a serious mark in the enemy. Otherwise, for the enhancements, one tricky squad that you can bounce around between units and reactive move with is great, and Veil Blade gives you more melee damage. Again, another scary character move there. Overall though, I can't see this being anywhere near as strong as the current shield host from the Index. Having just generally frightening characters, I'm just not sure outweighs the mortal wound protection that they got, plus the really big impactful stratagems that can affect entire squads of Custodes and not just their leaders. Next up, we're on to the Null, Maiden, Vigil. This was the detachment that's themed around the Sisters of Silence, the other talent of the Adeptus Custodes that specialise in bringing Psychers to heal. There's no restrictions in the detachment for whether or not you can take other Custodes units, as I would have guessed based on the other detachments in 10th edition. And while you don't get any direct support from the detachment rules, I guess you still would likely want some Adeptus Custodes around to do some heavy lifting for the Sisters, given that they just don't really have the profiles that can handily take on enemy tanks and vehicles. The detachment rule is 2-part. Prosecutors get battle line, so you can take a large number of Sisters of Silence with bolters if you want to. Previously they were battle line in the previous index, though it seems not anymore. Otherwise though, the core rule of the detachment is called Creeping Dread. It looks like they've taken a leaf from the Chaos Knight playbook here. Enemy units within 12 inches have to test Battle Shock in their command phase, not only if they're below half strength, but also if they're below starting strength at all, so have taken a wound on a big tough single model, or have taken a casualty out of a multi-model unit. On top of that, Psychers just need to test Battle Shock every single one of their command phases, whether they've taken damage or not. If such a unit is also below half strength as well, they get a -1 to the test. Overall, I'd say this maybe isn't what the Sisters of Silence needed to really be able to function as their own army. I feel like as with the recruits in the Tau Codex, they needed more of a damage and defensive type boost. They just don't really have the stat lines at the moment to really carry themselves on the front lines, nor enough units to do enough tricks to play clever moves with jumping in and out of terrain and things. The rule is definitely useful. If you played Chaos Knights, then I'm sure you'll notice a few more units failing Battle Shock tests, and occasionally that can swing victory points or cause other disruption. Unfortunately though, they don't get the damage boost element that the Chaos Knights get on their similar rule, and they don't really have the frontline durability that Knights have. I feel like for Sisters of Silence getting up in the enemy's faces, they're likely to take some heavy casualties with their toughness 3. It does seem like it's fun for disrupting enemies scoring points though, and it can be kind of punishing to certain armies like the Astra Militarum that rely on not being battle shocked to use their orders. Moving on to stratagems for the detachment, and all of these are locked to Anathema Psychana units. Kind of stands to reason that the support would be for them. If you are taking Custodes along, then their raw datasheet strength needs to be enough to carry them. First up for 1 CP we've got Desperation's Price. This one targets a psychic unit that's just used a psychic ability that targets one of your units or a psychic attack. That unit automatically becomes battle shocked, and on top of that they have to test leadership if they fail taking 3 mortal wounds. Kind of interesting that they can get auto battle shock this way. In theory that could be enough to stop them scoring certain objectives or stop them contesting you scoring. Given that most armies are leadership 7 or above though, the 3 mortal wounds isn't going to happen more often than not. For 1 CP, there's Witch Hunters, which is a battle tactic one, and it is another anti-psyker one. The unit that you nominate must target a psyker unit, but will either get sustained or lethal hits as to your choosing. But the unit that you select can only target psychic units. I say this one seems particularly standout weak to be honest, looks worse than the other damage dealing boosts that the core units get. Being completely locked to psychers means you can't use it in most matchups, the same as Desperation's Price unfortunately, so that's 2 options just outright gone if you're not fighting psychers. And then on top of that you can't use it on Witch Seekers, so that's 1 out of the 3 Sisters of Silence units that it doesn't have relevance for, and the Vigilators probably don't want the lethal hits bit, as they just want their devastating wounds. Overall I feel like it's kind of niche that you'd want this. Maybe if you're going just absolutely all out to buff up a unit of Vigilators, maybe using this and the one below. Speaking of which, the actual good one for Vigilators is Anathema Blade Mastery. This one's a battle tactic one, and a Vigilator unit gets to reroll all hit rolls. Against the Psychic units, you also get to reroll the wound roll as well. I think that seems alright to me. If you're hitting on 3+, then a reroll hit gives you a 33% damage increase. That seems at least scary enough on paper for a full unit worth of Great Blades. Against a Psychic unit though, it looks utterly ruinous given that they get their devastating wounds. I feel like there'd be at least some chance of them one-rounding things like Demon Primarchs if they rolled hot. Next up for 1 CP we've got Sidechaff Volley. This one's a Prosecutor locked one, and this one basically has Prosecutors handing out a damage debuff to an enemy unit. The unit is counted as Prosecutors, and then for the rest of the turn, other Anathema Psychana attacks against that same unit get an AP1 boost, so you could be hitting with Strength 4 AP1 Witch Seeker Flamers or AP3 Great Blades in close combat. If the unit happens to be either battle shocked or a Psyker as well, then they're also -1 to hit, and that lasts until the start of your next turn. As it goes, I feel like that could be at least a fairly nice damage boost, though it does require a bit of setup. If you're just about to charge a high armor save unit with some Vigilators, or just douse them in loads and loads of Flamer shots, then that could be nasty. Could give you a bit of a 1-2 punch, though I feel like it's just a little bit clunkier to pull off than some. For 1 command point for the Flamers though, there's one called Purgation Sweep, which I feel like is maybe one of the most interesting ones. Witch Seekers get +1 attack with their Flamers, or +2 attacks against Psychers or Battle Shocked units, though this one is only in your shooting phase only. You couldn't double down on this with Overwatch. In theory though, that does seem fairly scary on paper. 45 Strength 4 AP0 auto hits, going up to 55 of those if you happened to be targeting a Battle Shock foe. Still not going to be the end of the world to units with high toughness and good saves, but you are likely to stack at least a good number of saves on enemies, and that's going to be utterly ruinous to hordes. Finally for 1 CP, there's Psychic Abominations, a reactive stealth for an infantry unit when they get attacked, so that's -1 to hit in the shooting phase only. On top of that, if it was a Psyker trying to target your unit, they can only target them if they're within 12 inches of your squad, and not if they're further away. The Psyker bit's a bit whatever really, very useful against certain armies, though completely worthless against many. I say the reactive -1 to hit never really hurts to have, but it's kind of niche. you'd have to be in a position where the enemy isn't just going to wipe out your Sisters of Silence unit anyway. And I feel like with -1 to hit, it still doesn't really get these girls to a place where they're actually outright durable. Overall, can't say it's my favourite stratagem section in the world. The interesting ones feel like they're the unit locked ones, rerolls for the Vigilators, an APT buff for the Prosecutors, and perhaps particularly the potential 55 strength 4 hits from Witch Seekers. It does feel like a few too many of these are locked to either fighting Psykers or dependent on your opponent getting a unlucky Battle Shock fail. I'm not saying that doesn't make sense given the lore, but if the aim was to try and give them enough strength to have them stand on their own 2 feet and act as a completely independent army to the Custodes on the mainline damage front, I'm not sure it's going to be enough. Finally, we've got the enhancements for the detachment, and these are all Sisters of Silence only, as you'd expect, so these are literally all for the Knight Centurion datasheet and nothing else. First up, we've got the Raptor Blade, +1 attack, +1 strength and +1 damage to your melee weapons, really quite nice for the Great Blade. Seems like that one's a pretty easy include if it happens to be cheap enough. As ever, it gets scarier against Psykers, boosted to +2 attacks, +2 strength and +2 damage against them, so really quite fearsome against people who use Warpcraft. The next one is Enhanced Void Sheen Cloak. This one's -1 damage for the bearer only, changing the damage to 1 only if the enemy is either a Psyker or Battle Shocked. In general, I'd not rate this one as very good. You're not going to make a Knight Centurion into a durable unit with this debuff, and it's only going to be relevant anyway if all the bodyguards are dead, and even then you're only perhaps preserving one Knight Centurion on her own. Just whichever way you look at this, I don't feel like this one's going to be meaningful. Next up, we've got Huntress's Eye. This one hands out a Battle Shock in your command phase to one enemy unit within 12 inches, with no stipulation that they need to be in line of sight or anything like that. This one kind of feels a little bit similar to the Neurolictor rule for the Tyranids, which admittedly I would rate as a good one as Battle Shock shenanigans go. It means that, say, if you have units duking it out on objectives, then perhaps if you had one of these hidden out of line of sight but within range of that objective, you could potentially give your opponent a chance to fail Battle Shock if they hadn't already done so in their command phase. Seems like that one could be nice enough to have around. I'm not sure whether or not it's going to be good enough to justify the overall buy-in of the Knight Centurion plus retinue though. Perhaps you could have a somewhat threatening unit play cagey for a turn or two, handing out that debuff, and then step up to the fore a little bit later in the game like Battle Round 3 or 4. Finally, we've got Oblivion Knight, +1 to hit for their lead unit, and also a +1 to wound if the target happens to be a Psyker. This one feels like it's okay for Vigilators. It will up their threat just a little bit. A +1 to wound is situational, of course. I feel like if you're leading Prosecutors, it's just not really going to be worth it unless you had a big unit and this happens to be ridiculously cheap. And again, maybe a little bit depressing that they forgot about Witch Seekers for the core boost for this one. It's only going to be relevant against Psykers for them. Overall, out of the enhancements, I feel like the Raptor Blade is a pretty reasonable one. That does make a Knight Centurion pretty fighting, and the Huntress's Eye and the Oblivion Knight seem okay. Overall, though, I feel like these rules probably aren't going to be enough to carry a full Sisters of Silence army in the way that some people might have hoped that they could have functioned. I think it was always going to be a long shot when they only have 3 main datasheets. I'd guess that this detachment will be a bit more of a fun and fluff sort of detachment if you want to try and make some unusual rules work, as opposed to being any sort of competitive detachment. Finally, let's talk about the Shield Host. The index detachment that true to Games Workshop's word does seem to have been pretty much entirely rewritten for this codex. In all honesty though, I feel like if anything that's a bit of a disappointment. Unlike some of the detachments out there in 40k, it was generally considered to have some pretty interesting and impactful rules. The Mortal and Devastating Wound Protection helped the Custodians to function, and it did have access to some really quite big and meaningful moves that you could do, most of which unfortunately seem to have been taken away on the stratagem front. I still think it's interesting though, and at the right points cost could certainly lead to a strong Custodes army. The core rule has been swapped out from the 4+ save against mortal and devastating wounds to this martial mastery rule, basically a big durability hit in favour of a fairly major damage buff, though only for 1 turn. If you want protection against mortal wounds, then you'd have to go to the Talons of the Emperor detachment now and stand next to a Sister of Silence. The new rule is called Martial Mastery, and this almost feels like the Custodes version of calling the War for Orcs. The once per game damage buff that you trigger at the start of the battle round, so it does mean that your opponent can see it coming. And then you get 2 fairly significant damage boosts, critical hits on a 5+ for martial guitar models. That would mean that you get the sustained hits or the lethal hits on the 5+, adding up to around about a 15% damage boost for the sustained hits, or a 30% damage boost for the lethal hits if you were targeting an enemy unit that you were wounding on a 5+ originally. On top of that, all the Custodes' AP gets better, so that's AP2 for Castellan Axes and AP3 for Guardian Spears, really quite scary against highly armoured foes there. And it's basically going to be a turn where the Custodes can just absolutely destroy the hardest things in the enemy army. Most forces just can't afford to be on the receiving end of a full squad of Custodes with a character with these kind of boosts. It is just for one turn though, likely going to be triggered turn 2 or turn 3, depending on when you can maximally get stuck in. You don't want to leave it too late. And it does mean that if you call it in the start of the battle round, then your opponent could know that your Custodes are extra fightier for a turn and might choose to play it a bit more cagey. It is kind of interesting though, Custodes will be a lot weaker against mortal or devastating wounds. They really get a surge of damage if the opponent's a bit overconfident and allows you to break too many things. Stratagems wise, it's almost a total rewrite, there's only one that really remains similar. First up, we've got multi-potentiality, which I think is a fairly good one at least. You need to trigger it in the movement phase when a Custodes unit falls back, but then that unit gets to shoot and charge afterwards. So really quite good for a big unit that was locked up, maybe by a nuisance charge or an ongoing combat. You get to fire off all your Guardian Spear shooting and things, and then charge either the same target or something else. With the way that Custodes often like to play, that really feels like it's going to come up and be fairly relevant quite often. For 1 CP, the fairly similar one is Avenge the Fallen. At the start of the fight phase, choose a squad that's taken some casualties already. You get +1 attack per model if the unit's taken casualties, or +2 attacks instead if the squad's below half strength. I'd rate this one as perhaps situationally useful. Depending on the exact squad and the circumstances, you'd get between 2 and 5 extra attacks, which is alright. Given their Custodes with a martial guitar, they are going to leave a mark when you have that many more Guardian Spear hits. Maybe another 3 slain Horde models or a couple more dead Space Marines might be enough to tip the balance. I did have it pointed out in a previous video that previously it was a battle tactic stratagem and now it's not though, so you can't get it for free with a shield captain anymore. Next up, for 1 CP, we've got Unwavering Sentinels. This one was previously the Fights First stratagem that was sort of the bane of melee armies across 40k. It did make Custodes into a very, very hard army to play, as basically on the most meaningful combat, they'd be able to just jump in and get to strike down with all their Guardian Spears and hopefully kill whatever was charging them before they even take any damage. For better or worse though, that does seem to be gone. This one's now a -1 to hit for Custodes infantry units on an objective in melee. I feel like it'll come off enough that it will be useful, but it isn't really quite as powerful as it was. Maybe if you are being hit by something scary and you're being hit by a bunch of damage 3 attacks, it could prevent a few of them landing. Next up is another altered one in Arcane Genetic Alchemy. This one was previously a -1 damage option that cost 2 CP. This was quite a general purpose damage debuff one, where it was -1 damage for the unit that was targeted. And that could be absolutely massive on custodian units with 3 or 4 wounds. It means that you could have damage 2 attacks become damage 1, and damage 3 attacks more crucially going down to damage 2. So those kind of hits would need 2 failed saves to kill a custodian rather than just 1. This one's been side graded in that it now is a 4+ feel no pain type save that's reactive to mortal wounds. And in context of losing the defense against mortal wounds that you just got baked in on them before, I think it's very helpful to have. It means that if you have a unit that the enemy is just setting up to drown in mortal wounds from something arcane, then you can pop this and maybe save a custodian's life. It is annoying that without errata or anything like that though, it won't work on devastating wounds given that they're no longer mortal wounds anymore. I feel like this will be kind of next level if it also worked on devastating wounds, but currently it doesn't. Next, for 1 CP, we've got Archaeotech Munitions. Either sustained hits 1 or lethal hits at range, you get to choose. Custodes shooting certainly isn't the main event, though to be honest, even just a small flurry of Guardian Spear fire or a whole bunch of grenades from the Ballistus Terminator launchers, that can be enough to thoroughly maul an enemy infantry squad or similar. Definitely not to be underestimated, though I feel like either sustained hits or lethal hits isn't really huge enough to be really too excited about. Though I guess seeing as it's not locked to infantry or anything like that, you could use it on some really quite big threatening things, like give sustained hits to a Land Raider's las cannons perhaps, or could be okay for lethal hits on a Custodian Guard unit double shooting that wants to stack some unexpected hurt on an enemy tank. Feels like it would be at least fairly scary if you threw that into the combo of Custodian Guard with Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus. That could certainly do some work there. Finally, for 1 CP, there's Vigilance Eternal. This one's a battle line custodian unit, and it gets you sticky objectives triggered in the movement phase, so you could potentially use it on an objective that you just move on to. It doesn't have to be in the command phase like some copies of this rule. The sticky objectives rule means that the objective will remain yours until your opponent can control it at the start or end of any turn. These ones can be alright to have, it's not really too bad given how elite the army is, means that you could potentially be marking an objective you took in the midfield and then have your unit move off to try and fight with the enemy anew. Maybe occasionally it might remove the decision paralysis between just literally sitting still and scoring, or just going after the one enemy unit that you really want to chase down. Still though, if the enemy can reach it, then it's not going to do you much good, and it does feel like sort of throwing a command point at something that might not necessarily matter later in the game, though it depends how the battle's unfolding. Overall, it definitely feels like a massive come down from the stratagems they had before. Resurrecting a custodian is gone, the -1 damage is gone, as is the fights first. It's maybe a bit disappointing that the only battle tactic stratagem is the arcane genetic alchemy as well. It means that shield captains don't really have much to go at here. Previously at least, the Avenge the Fallen one was also a free battle tactic, but now it's not. Still though, even if the stratagems have been rather significantly reined in power, I still think that most of them are usable in the right situation. Fallback shoot and charge is pretty excellent to have for the Custodes. Avenge the Fallen could give you extra damage in the right circumstances, and -1 to hit and the feel no pain against mortal wounds I'm sure will come up. Finally, for the shield host, we've got the enhancements, which for the shield host appear to be entirely new, basically all the rest having gone over to the Auric Champions in a very similar form to how they are now. The new ones here start out with From the Hall of Armourers. This one's a personal melee damage boost, +1 strength and +1 damage to the bearer's melee weapons. It's shield captain only, so not for blade champions here sadly. And to be honest, if this one's fairly well costed, then I feel like a strength 8 and damage 3 guardian spear shield captain is a fair force to be reckoned with. Maybe just a shame that there aren't more battle tactic stratagems for him to use. It is going to have to compete against the Castellan's Mark though, as that one's also vying for shield captain usage. I feel like most of the time you don't normally want two different shield captains within the same detachment, and that means that you might be one or the other. The Castellan's Mark is a redeploy one, redeploying two Custodes units, not Sisters of Silence, after determining who has first turn, so you can basically get perfect knowledge of what the foe's about to do, and then put your units exactly where it makes most sense. If it makes most sense to return them to strategic reserve and maybe come in with deep strike at some stage, then you can do that instead. I feel like this one really is quite a powerful upgrade, with Custodes being kind of limited movement and mighty. You could be redeploying a pretty fantastic amount of points across the board with this, and if your opponent has just one first turn with some very shooty guns against a unit that you have to worry about, being able to just move that unit out of line of sight is very nice. I feel like this one could be a very popular one. The From the Fall of Armourers one I think is fun, but probably not going to be quite as useful on an overall army level. Otherwise, we've got the Auric Mantle, +2 wounds for a Blade Champion or Shield Captain. Not really going to change much in my opinion there, and I feel like for Shield Captains you've already got the choice of two good ones already, which this one's worse than. I guess if you want an unusually tanky Blade Champion and this is super cheap, could be an option. Finally, we've got the Panoptispex. That one grants you ignores cover for the lead unit of a Shield Captain or Blade Champion. Again, if that one's cheap enough, I think it's genuinely nice to have on, say, a unit of Custodian Guard that can threaten rapid firing at those Guardian Spears. Does feel like a bit of an extra upgrade though, that might not make the cut if you've got more important things to buy in with your points. Could get some more significant firepower on Terminators or Bikes, or things like Sagittarium Custodes potentially. Overall, in raw overall power, I feel like the standard shield host has probably hit a bit of a downgrade here. The once per game big damage boost I think is meaningful, though I feel like the stratagems that they've traded out for don't really quite equate to the power of resurrecting Custodes, -1 damage, fights first, and they've also lost the +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles, which was a pretty big one. Still though, certainly wouldn't say it's awful, provided the Custodes units are costed appropriately for their defensive profiles. Feels like it could be a bit more mainstream than Auric Champions or the Sisters of Silence detachment. I feel like it'd probably be this one competing versus the Talons of the Emperor overall. In any case though, big news for the Custodes. As mentioned, I don't really feel like these rules are going to massively please people, as they just don't really feel quite as exciting as what we had in the Index Shield host. I'll certainly be interested to hear your thoughts though. I'll certainly look forward to trying to put them in a bit more context when we have datasheet rules and the rest of the rules from the Talons of the Emperor detachment. Finally, as mentioned at the start of the video, if you are looking to pick up the Custodes Combat Patrol, Battle Force or Codex, you can support the channel by buying through any of the links in the video description at a big discount compared with Games Workshop. The pre-orders going live on Saturday. Anything bought through those does help to support Auspex Tactics a little bit. In any case though, let me know what you're thinking. Between these and what we know of the Talons, what do you think is going to emerge as the strongest Custodes detachment? I will look forward to hearing your opinions in the comments. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.